Hello, students. This lesson was designed for those looking to advance their English listening skills to the academic level and for those interested in learning about psychology at the university level. This lesson covers Chapter 1 of 16 and is part of our comprehensive audio course adapted from the textbook Psychology 2E. Be sure to like this video and subscribe to the channel so you'll be notified as each new chapter is released, and for future videos to advance your English language skills. Let's get started. Chapter 1. Introduction to Psychology. Let's talk about some fascinating stories that highlight the complexities of the human brain. First, there's Clive Waring, an accomplished musician who, at the age of 46, lost his ability to form new memories after falling ill. Remarkably, Clive can still play the piano flawlessly, but he has no recollection of what he ate just an hour ago. Then we have James Wannerton, who experiences a rare phenomenon where the sounds of words trigger specific taste sensations. For example, the sound of his former girlfriend's name actually tasted like rhubarb to him. And finally, there's John Nash, a brilliant mathematician and Nobel Prize winner. During his time as a professor at MIT, Nash started to believe that coded messages from extraterrestrial beings were hidden in the New York Times, meant specifically for him. He began hearing voices and grew increasingly suspicious of those around him. Eventually, he was diagnosed with schizophrenia and admitted to a state-run mental institution. His extraordinary life and struggles were depicted in the 2001 film A Beautiful Mind. Now, why did these individuals have such experiences? How does the brain work to produce thoughts, behaviors, and perceptions? And what is the connection between our brain's internal processes and how we act outwardly? These are some of the key questions that the field of psychology aims to answer. And this course will explore the many ways researchers have studied them. What is psychology? What is creativity? What are prejudice and discrimination? What is consciousness? These are just a few of the intriguing questions that psychology seeks to explore. At its core, psychology is the scientific study of the mind and behavior. Psychologists rely on the scientific method to gain knowledge. This begins with a researcher posing a question about how or why something happens, and then proposing a tentative explanation called a hypothesis to address the phenomenon. A hypothesis should align with a scientific theory, which is a well-supported and broad explanation for a particular aspect of the natural world. A theory represents the best understanding we currently have of that topic. To test a hypothesis, researchers make observations or conduct experiments to determine its validity. The results are shared through publications or conferences, allowing others to replicate or expand on the findings. In psychology, scientists focus on what is perceivable and measurable. For instance, while we cannot test the idea that a bird sings because it's happy, since we can't measure happiness in birds, we can ask individuals why they sing because they can tell us. This reliance on measurable, observable data is why psychology is described as an empirical science. Science, in general, deals only with what can be measured, matter and energy. This limitation makes it challenging to scientifically understand abstract concepts like thoughts or values, which are not easily defined in terms of matter or energy. Still, the scientific method based on observation and experimentation rather than logic or tradition remains psychology's foundation. Interestingly, psychology only became recognized as a distinct academic discipline in the late 1800s. Before that, the study of the mind was considered part of philosophy. Given that human behavior has biological roots, some areas of psychology overlap with natural sciences like biology. However, no biological organism exists in isolation, and our interactions with others shape our behavior. For this reason, psychology is also considered a social science, bridging the gap between biology and the social world. Why study psychology? Many students take their first psychology course because they're curious about themselves and others. They want to understand why people act the way they do, or are motivated by a desire to help others. Others may take psychology because it satisfies a general education requirement, or as part of their program of study, such as nursing or pre-med. Interestingly, a significant number of these students develop such a strong interest in the subject that they choose psychology as their major. It's no surprise that psychology is one of the most popular majors on college campuses in the United States. Some well-known figures who majored in psychology include Mark Zuckerberg, Jon Stewart, Natalie Portman, and Wes Craven. In fact, about 6% of all bachelor's degrees awarded in the U.S. are in psychology. Studying psychology offers many valuable benefits. Psychology students develop critical thinking skills and gain training in the scientific method. Critical thinking involves actively applying skills to evaluate and understand information. In today's world, where we are surrounded by competing facts, many of which can be misleading, critical thinking is more important than ever. It means maintaining a skeptical attitude, recognizing internal biases, thinking logically, asking the right questions, and making careful observations. Psychology coursework also helps students improve their communication skills, contributing to their scientific literacy and their ability to evaluate the sources of information they encounter. Beyond these skills, studying psychology provides insight into the many factors that influence behavior. Students learn to appreciate the complex interplay between biology, environment, and personal experience. They explore the principles that guide human thought and behavior and come to understand the incredible diversity that exists among individuals and across cultures. This broader understanding of human behavior prepares psychology students to approach the world with greater empathy and insight. Psychology is a relatively young science, with its experimental roots tracing back to the 19th century. In comparison, fields like human physiology have much earlier origins. Before psychology became a distinct discipline, questions about the mind were typically explored through philosophy. However, during the 19th century, two scholars, Wilhelm Wundt and William James, paved the way for psychology to emerge as a separate science and academic field. Wilhelm Wundt, a German scientist, is often regarded as the first psychologist. His influential book, Principles of Physiological Psychology, was published in 1873, and he viewed psychology as the scientific study of conscious experience. Wundt's goals was to identify the individual components of consciousness and understand how they combined to create our conscious experience. To achieve this, he developed a method called introspection, or internal perception, where individuals would examine their own conscious thoughts as objectively as possible. He believed that, like any aspect of nature, the human mind could be studied scientifically. Wundt also emphasized voluntarism, the idea that people have free will and should understand the intentions of psychological experiments in which they participate. His introspection method, which he called experimental introspection, included precise instruments to measure reaction time. For example, his laboratory at the University of Leipzig, established in 1879, conducted experiments where participants were exposed to stimuli, such as lights, images, or sounds. Their reactions, like pressing a button, were measured down to 1/1000th of a second. Interestingly, Wundt believed that psychology should extend beyond the laboratory to include cultural studies. As he argued in his 1904 book, Völkerpsychologie. One of Wundt's students, Edward Titchener, later developed structuralism, a perspective focused on understanding the contents of mental processes rather than their functions. While Wundt's methods were groundbreaking, the introspection process was highly subjective, leading to inconsistent results between participants. Despite this limitation, Wundt's work laid the foundation for psychology as we know it today. William James, along with John Dewey and Charles Sanders Peirce, played a key role in establishing functional psychology. They embraced Darwin's theory of evolution by natural selection, viewing it as a framework for understanding an organism's characteristics, including its behavior. According to this theory, natural selection shapes organisms to adapt to their environments, ensuring survival and reproduction. Adaptation refers to traits that serve a specific purpose for an organism's survival, having been naturally selected over time. James believed the purpose of psychology was to study the function of behavior in the real world. This perspective became known as functionalism. Functionalism focused on how mental activities help organisms adapt to their environments. It also emphasized understanding the operation of the entire mind, rather than isolating its individual components, as structuralism did. While James recognized introspection as one way to study mental activities, he also incorporated more objective methods into his work. These include using recording devices, examining tangible outcomes of mental processes, and studying anatomy and physiology. This broader approach helped shape functionalism as a dynamic framework for understanding how mental and behavioral processes contribute to an organism's ability to thrive in its environment. One of the most influential and well-known figures in psychology's history is Sigmund Freud. Born in 1856, Freud was an Austrian neurologist who developed a deep interest in understanding patients with conditions like hysteria and neurosis. At the time, hysteria was a term used to describe a range of symptoms, including physical and emotional disturbances, that appeared to have no clear physical cause. Freud proposed that many of these issues stemmed from the unconscious mind, a part of our psyche containing feelings and urges outside of our conscious awareness. Freud believed that accessing the unconscious was key to resolving a patient's problems. He developed techniques to explore the unconscious, such as analyzing dreams, examining the first words that came to a person's mind, and interpreting slips of the tongue. These methods became central to his psychoanalytic theory, which emphasized the influence of the unconscious and early childhood experiences on behavior. This perspective dominated clinical psychology for several decades and left a lasting legacy in the field. Freud's ideas have had a profound influence on psychology, and you will encounter his concepts in areas like lifespan development, personality, and therapy. Many therapists today still emphasize the unconscious mind and the lasting impact of early childhood experiences on a person's life. While Freud didn't invent the method of psychoanalysis, which involves patients talking about their experiences and inner selves, he popularized it, and it remains a key approach in therapy. However, not all of Freud's ideas have been embraced without controversy. Some critics focus on his earlier theories without considering his later writings or the broader principles he introduced. These include the significance of childhood experiences in shaping adult motivations, the interplay of unconscious and conscious forces in behavior, the role of conflicting motivations, the influence of mental representations of ourselves and others, and the development of personality over time. Research has provided support for many of these foundational ideas. Modern adaptations of Freud's clinical approaches have shown empirical effectiveness. For instance, some psychotherapy practices today explore unconscious aspects of the self and relationships, often through the dynamic between therapist and client. Freud's contributions to clinical practice and his historical significance ensure his lasting place in discussions about psychology's evolution. Max Wertheimer, Kurt Koffka, and Wolfgang Kohler were three German psychologists who played a key role in introducing Gestalt principles to the United States in the early 20th century. These scholars, fleeing Nazi Germany, brought with them a unique perspective on psychology. The term Gestalt roughly translates to whole, reflecting the central idea that while sensory experiences can be broken into individual parts, the way these parts relate to one another as a whole is often more important to perception. For instance, consider a song. While it consists of individual notes played by various instruments, the melody, rhythm, and harmony come together to create the full experience of the song. This holistic approach contrasted sharply with Wundt's structuralism, which focused on breaking down mental processes into their smallest components. Despite their groundbreaking ideas, these psychologists faced significant challenges after relocating to the United States. They had to abandon much of their work and were unable to continue large-scale research. Additionally, the rise of behaviorism in the U.S. overshadowed Gestalt psychology, limiting its influence compared to its prominence in Germany. However, the impact of Gestalt principles endures. The emphasis on understanding the individual as a whole, rather than as a sum of parts, laid the groundwork for later developments in humanistic theory. Gestalt ideas also continue to shape research in sensation and perception, emphasizing the importance of context and relationships in our experiences. While structuralism, Freud, and Gestalt psychology focused on inner experiences, a new group of researchers turned their attention to observable behavior. They believed that studying the outcomes of mental processes, rather than the processes themselves, was the key to making psychology a true science. This shift marked the rise of behaviorism, which would become a dominant force in psychology. During the early 20th century at Johns Hopkins University, John B. Watson challenged the focus on consciousness that had been emphasized by scholars like Wundt and James. He argued that the study of consciousness was fundamentally flawed, believing that it was impossible to objectively analyze the mind. Instead, Watson preferred to zero in on observable actions and the ways they could be managed and predicted. This shift in focus from examining the mind to examining behavior became known as behaviorism. Behaviorists were especially interested in learning and how learned behaviors interact with an organism's natural traits. Experiments frequently involved animal subjects under the assumption that insights gained from these models could help explain human behavior. One researcher even suggested that nearly everything important in psychology could be investigated by analyzing how rats navigate a maze, illustrating the behaviorist's conviction that studying observable, measurable responses was the most reliable path to understanding psychological processes. Behaviorism remained the dominant force in experimental psychology for many years, and its impact continues to shape the field. By relying on objective methods and carefully controlled experiments, behaviorism helped establish psychology as a scientific discipline. Behaviorism also finds practical application in areas such as behavioral and cognitive behavioral therapy, classroom behavior modification, and research on how our environment can influence our actions. One key figure in this movement was the American psychologist B.F. Skinner, who focused on how behavior is affected by its consequences. Skinner introduced concepts like reinforcement and punishment as powerful forces that guide behavior. In his research, he developed a specialized apparatus, often called the Skinner box, which allowed for precise study of how behaviors could be modified by different types of rewards or penalties. This approach remains an essential tool for understanding how environmental factors help shape both human and animal behavior. A Skinner box is a chamber designed to keep an animal separated from the outside world, featuring a lever or button the animal can press. When pressed, the box delivers either a positive reinforcement, like food, or a punishment, such as an unpleasant noise. Skinner's emphasis on the power of reinforcement, both positive and negative, in shaping behaviors has had a considerable influence on psychology. Though this influence has declined somewhat with the rise of cognitive psychology. Nevertheless, the principle of conditioning remains a key tool in modifying human behavior. In the early 20th century, American psychology was primarily defined by behaviorism and psychoanalysis. However, some psychologists felt that these perspectives were too limiting. They took issue with Freud's focus on the unconscious, which they viewed as overly pessimistic, and they disliked the reductionist emphasis of behaviorism, which frames behavior as entirely determined by genetics and environment. Looking for a broader, more optimistic approach, they developed humanism, a view that highlights the inherent goodness and potential in all people. Two leading figures in humanistic psychology were Abraham Maslow and Carl Rogers. Abraham Maslow became especially recognized for proposing a hierarchy of human needs. According to his model, if our basic survival needs, like food, water, and shelter, are met, then higher-level social needs begin to guide our behavior. At the pinnacle of Maslow's hierarchy is self-actualization, the process by which we reach our fullest potential. Consistent with the humanistic perspective, Maslow and others resisted the reductionist research methods typical of the physical and biological sciences, instead championing a more holistic, person-centered approach. While much of this research is qualitative, there are also quantitative studies exploring happiness, self-concept, meditation, and the impact of humanistic therapies. Carl Rogers was an American psychologist who, much like Abraham Maslow, believed in the innate potential for goodness within all people. He introduced a therapeutic approach called client-centered therapy, which puts the individual seeking help at the forefront of the therapeutic process. Instead of having the therapist interpret behaviors to uncover unconscious motives, this approach allows the client to steer the conversation, reflecting the idea that people possess the inner resources to address their own challenges. Rogers believed that, to be most effective, therapists should embody three essential qualities: unconditional positive regard, genuineness, and empathy. Unconditional positive regard means fully accepting clients without judgment, regardless of what they share during sessions. These core principles have significantly influenced the broader field of psychology. Both Rogers and Maslow remain central figures, and their perspectives continue to shape how modern psychologists understand human behavior and potential. In fact, many therapists today still rely on Rogers' client-centered therapy methods, demonstrating the enduring power of his belief in every individual's capacity for growth and healing. Behaviorism's strong focus on objectivity and external behavior caused a prolonged shift away from studying the mind. The early humanistic psychologists helped move attention back to viewing individuals as whole, conscious, and self-aware beings. By the 1950s, fresh perspectives from linguistics, neuroscience, and computer science were emerging, sparking renewed interest in the mind as a subject of scientific inquiry. This shift in focus became known as the cognitive revolution, and Ulrich Nasir's textbook on cognitive psychology soon became a foundational resource in the field. Although no single individual can be credited with launching the cognitive revolution, Noam Chomsky played a significant role in its beginnings. As an American linguist, Chomsky was dissatisfied with the dominant influence of behaviorism, believing that concentrating solely on behavior was too narrow. He argued that mental processes had to be reintroduced into psychology's scope if the field hoped to make meaningful contributions to understanding how and why we behave as we do. European psychology was never as heavily influenced by behaviorism as American psychology was, so the cognitive revolution helped reconnect European and American psychologists. In addition, this shift encouraged collaboration with experts in fields such as anthropology, linguistics, computer science, and neuroscience. This interdisciplinary approach came to be known as the cognitive sciences, and its ideas remain highly influential in contemporary psychology. Culture shapes individuals, groups, and entire societies. A central challenge for researchers is recognizing that certain populations have been studied more extensively than others, and findings from these groups don't always apply to everyone. One example is how Western, educated, industrialized, rich, and democratic communities have been overly represented in research, leading to flawed assumptions about people in other cultural settings. In reality, people in less industrialized or non-Western societies can come from WEIRD populations in crucial ways, including perception, cooperation, and moral reasoning. Psychologists address these differences in two related fields: multicultural psychology, which focuses on diverse groups within a single country, and cross-cultural psychology, which compares groups across different countries. In the United States, Francis Cecil Sumner became the first African American to earn a PhD in psychology, and went on to establish a psychology program that trained future generations of African American psychologists. Early psychologists from diverse backgrounds often worked to counter biases in intelligence testing and to innovate educational approaches for children. One such advocate was George L. Sanchez, who highlighted how language and cultural barriers in testing could limit educational opportunities for Mexican American children. Meanwhile, Mamie Phillips Clark and Kenneth Clark conducted landmark research on African American children's preferences for dolls, which played a key role in the Supreme Court's Brown v. Board of Education decision against school segregation. They later opened the first Child Guidance Center in Harlem, demonstrating how research findings can be turned into practical interventions. Professional organizations for psychologists from various ethnic backgrounds now help foster ongoing research, ensuring that cultural factors remain a central focus in understanding human behavior. Women have been making significant contributions to psychology since the field's earliest days. In 1894, Margaret Floy Washburn became the first woman to earn a doctoral degree in psychology. Her book, The Animal Mind, a textbook of comparative psychology, served as a standard reference for more than 20 years. Around the same time, Mary Whiton Calkins met every requirement for a PhD in psychology, yet Harvard University refused to grant her the degree because she was a woman. She had studied under William James and explored memory research focused on primacy and recency. Calkins also wrote about how both structuralism and functionalism explain self-psychology. Another pioneering figure, Mary Cover Jones, conducted a follow-up study to John B. Watson's famous Little Albert experiment by unconditioning fear in Little Peter, who was initially frightened of rabbits. Ethnic minority women also played key roles in expanding the field. Martha Bernal was the first Latina to earn a PhD in psychology in 1962, devoting much of her research to Mexican American children. Inez Beverly Prosser became the first African American woman to earn a PhD in 1933. examining the educational issues that affected Black students. These trailblazers opened doors for future generations, advancing the study of psychology and broadening its perspective to include diverse voices and experiences. Contemporary psychology is a dynamic and diverse field enriched by various historical perspectives. This diversity is mirrored within the American Psychological Association, the world's largest organization of psychologists. The APA's mission is to promote and disseminate psychological knowledge to improve human well-being. With 54 divisions, the APA covers a vast range of specialties, from the psychology of religion and spirituality to exercise and sports psychology, and behavioral neuroscience and comparative psychology. Members of the APA range from students to seasoned doctoral level psychologists and hail from diverse backgrounds, including educational settings, criminal justice, hospitals, the military, and industry. G. Stanley Hall, the first president of the APA, had an interesting career path that included teaching at Wilberforce University, a historically Black university, before earning his PhD under William James, and later founding Clark University in Massachusetts. In addition to the APA, the Association for Psychological Science was established in 1988 to promote the scientific approach in psychology. The founding of APS was driven by tensions between the scientific and clinical branches within the APA. APS publishes several research journals and is involved in education and advocacy efforts. There are also several organizations that provide networking and collaboration opportunities for psychologists from various ethnic or racial backgrounds, focusing on issues pertinent to their specific communities. These include the National Latino Psychological Association, the Asian American Psychological Association, the Association of Black Psychologists, and the Society of Indian Psychologists. This rich landscape reflects the varied and evolving nature of psychology as a discipline. The upcoming sections of this course will explore the major subdivisions of psychology, providing insights into the primary areas of research and practice that define modern psychology. This overview is intended to set the stage for a deeper exploration of each specialty as you progress through the course. Biopsychology examines how our biology influences behavior, focusing specifically on how the structure and function of the nervous system relate to various behaviors. Biological psychologists often merge the research methodologies of psychologists and physiologists to investigate areas like sensory and motor systems, sleep patterns, drug use, ingestive behaviors, and neurodevelopment, among others. This interdisciplinary field, which includes contributions from biologists, medical professionals, and chemists, is part of the broader discipline known as neuroscience. While biopsychology concentrates on the immediate physiological causes of behavior, evolutionary psychology explores the ultimate biological reasons behind behaviors, assuming these have been shaped by natural selection. This field studies behaviors that are thought to have adapted over time to various environments, both physical and social, and originated from the evolutionary theories of Charles Darwin. Darwin suggested that behaviors, like physical traits, are adaptive, and his works further explored these concepts. Evolutionary psychology has seen a resurgence in recent years. For behavior to be influenced by evolution, it must have a significant genetic component. Since genetic differences among human groups are minimal, behaviors that are genetically caused are expected to be universally present across all human cultures. Evolutionary psychologists often predict the outcomes of behaviors in specific situations based on evolutionary theory, and then test these predictions through observations or experiments. However, linking behaviors directly to genetics and demonstrating that they are adaptive can be challenging, especially in humans due to the complexities of distinguishing genetic influences from cultural ones. Many of our current behavioral traits were shaped under historical, environmental, and social conditions that are vastly different from today's, making it difficult to ascertain whether these behaviors are still adaptive. Despite these challenges, evolutionary psychology has provided valuable insights into human behaviors, such as memory, mate selection, and social organization. For instance, in a cross-cultural study on mate preferences, David Boos found consistent differences between men and women across 37 cultures, aligning with evolutionary predictions, although there were some cultural deviations. Scientists interested in the psychological aspects of sensory systems as well as the psychological experience of sensory information operate within the realm of sensation and perception. This field is notably interdisciplinary, blending elements from both biology and psychology to understand how we receive and interpret sensory data. Considering the experience of walking between buildings when moving from one class to another, you are bombarded with a variety of sensory inputs, sights, sounds, tactile sensations, and smells. You also feel the temperature of the air and maintain your balance. These myriad inputs are processed by your sensory systems and contribute to your ongoing perception of the world. However, as we will explore in more depth in a later chapter on sensation and perception, the way we experience the world is not merely a straightforward sum of all sensory information. Instead, our perception is shaped by a complex interplay of factors, including where we direct our attention, our past experiences, and our cultural backgrounds. This complexity ensures that each individual's perception of the world is unique and influenced by both their biological senses and their psychological context. The cognitive revolution refocused the attention of psychologists on the intricacies of the mind and the mental processes that underpin behavior. Cognitive psychology, as a result, explores studying conditions or thoughts and their connections to our experiences and actions. This branch of psychology encompasses a wide range of topics, including attention, problem-solving, language, and memory. Its scope is broad, and it often involves interdisciplinary collaborations, leading some experts to use the term cognitive science to describe the extensive cross-disciplinary nature of research in this field. Given its expansive range, cognitive psychology isn't confined to a single chapter in textbooks, but is integrated throughout various sections. Concepts from cognitive psychology are woven into discussions on sensation and perception, thinking and intelligence, memory, lifespan, development, social psychology, and therapy. This integration underscores the foundational role that cognitive processes play in understanding both individual and collective human behavior. Developmental psychology explores the scientific study of growth and change across the lifespan, extending beyond just physical maturation to include cognitive skills, moral reasoning, social behavior, and other psychological attributes. Historically, the field focused primarily on changes from infancy through adulthood, shedding light on the various developmental stages that differentiate children from adults. A classic example of early developmental research is Jean Piaget's work on object permanence, the understanding that objects continue to exist even when they are out of sight. While adults easily grasp this concept, very young infants may act as if an object ceases to exist once it is hidden. The age at which children achieve object permanence is a topic of debate among researchers. In recent years, there has been a shift towards studying later stages of life, likely reflecting changing demographics in developed countries. As populations age and people live longer, understanding the psychological changes that accompany later life stages has become increasingly important. For instance, in the United States, the population of individuals aged 65 or older was over 40 million in 2010, reached 55 million by 2020, and expected to reach nearly 90 million by 2050. This demographic shift underscores the need for expanded research in developmental psychology to better understand the full arc of human development. Personality psychology examines the unique patterns of thoughts and behaviors that distinguish each individual. Notable figures in the history of psychology, such as Freud, Maslow, and American psychologist Gordon Allport, have contributed foundational theories to this field. Each of these theorists provided different perspectives on how personality develops. Freud, for example, suggested that personality results from the resolution of conflicts between the conscious and unconscious parts of the mind throughout various psychosexual stages of development. However, many of Freud's ideas were controversial and difficult to test experimentally. In contemporary research, the study of personality has adopted a more qualitative approach. Modern researchers focus less on explaining the origins of personality and more on identifying and measuring personality traits to predict how individuals would behave in various situations. The concept of personality traits, consistent patterns of thought and behavior, has been refined into the Big Five, or five-factor model. This model includes the traits of conscientiousness, agreeableness, neuroticism, openness, and extroversion. Research has shown that these traits are relatively stable throughout life and are influenced by genetic factors. This shift towards a more empirical and measurable approach has helped standardize the study of personality and facilitated a deeper understanding of how traits influence individual behavior. Social psychology explores how we interact with and relate to others, focusing on various phenomena that shape interpersonal relationships and behaviors. Social psychologists investigate topics like attribution differences, how we explain our own behaviors versus others, as well as prejudice, attraction, and conflict resolution. They also study how the presence of others can alter our behaviors and thought patterns. One particularly notable example of social psychological research is Stanley Milgram's obedience studies, which are among the most controversial in the field. In the early 1960s, following the trial of Nazi war criminal Adolf Eichmann, many questioned how German soldiers could have committed atrocities during the Holocaust merely on the basis of following orders. At that time, the prevailing belief among psychologists was that very few people would willingly inflict severe pain or suffering simply because they were ordered to do so. Milgram set out to test this belief by setting up an experiment in which participants thought they were delivering lethal electric shocks to another person, under the direction of an authority figure in a lab coat. Remarkably, he found that nearly 2/3 of the participants were willing to administer these shocks, despite only being required to show up to receive payment for their participation. They could have opted out without inflicting pain or suffering any consequences. Importantly, no actual harm was done during Milgram's study. It involved Confederates, individuals who appeared to be part of the study but were in fact in league with the researchers and acted according to a script. This experiment raised significant ethical concerns and highlighted the potential emotional harm to participants involved in deceptive research practices. As a result, it led to the development of stricter ethical guidelines in psychological research, emphasizing the necessity of informed consent and restricting the use of deception unless it is deemed harmless. Industrial organizational psychology is a specialized area of psychology focused on applying psychological theories, principles, and research findings specifically in industry and organizational settings. These psychologists play a crucial role in addressing issues related to personnel management, organizational structure, and the overall workplace environment. Businesses frequently rely on their expertise to make optimal hiring decisions and to foster an environment that enhances employee productivity and efficiency. Besides its practical applications, industrial organizational psychology is also dedicated to conducting scientific research on workplace behavior. Health psychology examines how health is influenced by the interplay of biological, psychological, and socio-cultural factors, utilizing an approach known as the biopsychosocial model. Health psychologists aim to improve individual health outcomes through public policy, education, intervention, and research. They may explore how genetic factors, behavioral patterns, relationships, and psychological stress affect health. Additionally, they investigate effective strategies to encourage individuals to modify behaviors that adversely impact their health. Researchers in sport and exercise psychology explore the psychological facets of sport performance, focusing on elements like motivation and performance anxiety, as well as the impacts of sport on mental and emotional well-being. Their studies extend to the psychological components of physical exercise in general. The field encompasses a range of topics that, while broader than just sport and exercise, involve the interplay between mental and physical performance under strenuous conditions. This includes scenarios such as firefighting, military operations, artistic performances, and surgical procedures. Clinical psychology is the branch of psychology dedicated to diagnosing and treating psychological disorders and other challenging behavior patterns. This field is largely applied. However, some clinicians also contribute to scientific research. Counseling psychology, a related discipline, focuses on emotional, social, vocational, and health-related outcomes in individuals deemed psychologically healthy. Historically, the theories of Freud and Rogers have significantly influenced the therapeutic approaches used in psychotherapy. While some contemporary therapists utilize psychoanalytic methods from a psychodynamic perspective, the concept of a client-centered therapy introduced by Rogers remains particularly impactful among clinicians today. Moreover, the emergence of behaviorism and the cognitive revolution have profoundly shaped clinical practices, leading to the development of behavioral therapy, cognitive therapy, and cognitive behavioral therapy. The diagnosis and treatment of psychological issues are not only central to clinical psychology, but also represent the aspect of psychology most often depicted in popular media, leading many to equate that all psychology with clinical psychology mistakenly. Forensic psychology is a specialized field of psychology that intersects with the justice system. Forensic psychologists and forensic psychiatrists play crucial roles in assessing a person's competency to stand trial, determining a defendant's state of mind, consulting on child custody cases, and making recommendations for sentencing and treatment. They also provide expert advice on matters such as eyewitnesses and children's testimony. In their role as expert witnesses, they offer insights based on research or expertise to aid court cases. Forensic psychologists need a robust understanding of legal principles to effectively communicate their psychological expertise within the legal framework. Additionally, they contribute to jury selection, witness preparation, and may provide psychological treatment in the criminal justice system. Although a small subset, criminal profilers also work as consultants to law enforcement, applying psychological insights to aid in criminal investigations. Psychologists have a range of career opportunities and can work in various settings. Generally, those aiming for a career in psychology at a 4-year higher education institution need to obtain a doctoral degree in psychology for certain specialties, or at least a master's degree for others. In most psychology fields, this involves earning a PhD. While PhD stands for Doctor of Philosophy, the term philosophy here does not specifically refer to the philosophical discipline, but rather to a broad array of disciplinary perspectives traditionally found in a college of liberal arts and sciences. The process of earning a PhD can differ significantly by country and institution, but it typically requires the completion of a dissertation, a detailed research project that is part of the doctoral training. In the United States, for instance, a dissertation must usually be defended in front of a committee of experts. Upon obtaining a PhD, one may pursue a faculty position at a college or a university. Faculty roles often involve a combination of teaching, research, and service to the institution and the field. The proportion of time dedicated to each responsibility can vary greatly between institutions, and faculty members may move between different schools seeking the environment that best fits their personal and professional needs. Depending on their training, someone in an academic setting might work as a biological psychologist, a clinical psychologist, or another specialty within psychology. Individuals aiming to become practicing clinical psychologists might consider pursuing a PsyD, or Doctor of Psychology degree, which is gaining popularity among those interested in clinical careers. PsyD programs typically focus on practical applications of psychological principles in clinical settings rather than on research skills. Whether pursuing a PhD or a PsyD, in most states, those intending to practice as licensed clinical or counseling psychologists are required to complete postdoctoral work under the supervision of a licensed psychologist. Recently, some states have started to eliminate this postdoctoral requirement, potentially accelerating the start of professional careers. Once the state's specific requirements are fulfilled, candidates must pass a licensure exam to officially become licensed clinical or counseling psychologists. These professionals can work in diverse settings, from private practices to hospitals. It's important to distinguish between clinical psychologists and psychiatrists. While both can offer therapy and counseling, clinical psychologists, who may hold a PhD or PsyD, are qualified to administer and interpret psychological tests. Psychiatrists, on the other hand, hold a Doctor of Medicine degree and have the authority to prescribe medications. PhD holders can find employment in various settings based on their specialization. For instance, a biopsychologist might work in a pharmaceutical company testing new drugs, while someone trained in clinical psychology could work as a forensic psychologist within the legal system, offering recommendations during trials and parole hearings, or acting as a court expert. Earning a doctoral degree in psychology typically requires 5 to 6 years of graduate study, but numerous careers can be pursued with just a master's degree in psychology. Those interested in providing psychotherapy, for instance, can become licensed professional counselors with a master's degree. This level of education is also adequate for school psychologists, certain roles in sports psychology, and consulting positions in industrial settings. Additionally, undergraduate coursework in psychology can lead to careers in psychiatric social work or psychiatric nursing, where therapy and assessments are part of the responsibilities. The foundational knowledge and skills gained from an undergraduate education in psychology are highly valued by employers, opening up diverse career opportunities for those with bachelor's degrees. Graduates may find roles as case managers, sales representatives, human resources personnel, or high school teachers. The field of healthcare also offers various opportunities where a background in psychology is advantageous, sometimes even necessary. For instance, the medical college admission test, a requirement for medical school admission, now includes a section on the psychological foundations of behavior, further underscoring the relevance of psychology in a broad array of professions.